Hello everybody and welcome. I'm just going to let you get logged on and get all the audio working. Let's give you 20 odd seconds, have a sip of water. Just a message to have a look at in the chat there, just about the fact that we're going to be recording this session and yeah, what to do if you do not want to be recorded. There will be the opportunity for you to participate, because what we're going to look at today is all around participation and getting involved. So there will be opportunities for you to switch off your video and get involved if you would like, but just to know if you do that, you will also be recorded. Fabulous. Well, hopefully you've all managed to get in. I know there'll be people jumping in just as we go, but I can make a slow start on our introduction to the reason that you've come. So thanks so much for signing up and coming along to learn a little bit about what we've been doing in the university over the last few months around carbon literacy. Might be something you're aware of, might be something that you need to learn a little bit more about. So we're going to introduce the concept, and then we are going to present part of the carbon literacy training that we've been doing in the university, and it'll be presented by a new professional training network that we have started and been rolling out the training since January this year. So just to introduce me quickly, I'm not going to be around too much, but I am a certified carbon literacy trainer. I work as part of a collective of carbon literacy trainers called Speak Carbon. I'll speak to that a little bit afterwards. Whenever I come into training, whenever I come into any forum, actually, I come here as a peer, or as somebody who wants to be part of the group discovery that happens. I'm not an expert, and we don't need to be experts in order to engage and put carbon literacy training projects together. We need to learn a little bit about how we facilitate discussions and how we bring everyone's knowledge in the room together into one place. I do study sustainability and behaviour change at Masters, and I am an accredited carbon literacy trainer. But again, that doesn't make me an expert. In fact, the more I learn, the less I know. Also, always say that I don't come as a sustainability angel. So particularly because I live in York, I do training all around the country. You may well see me driving in my car to the shops or something like that, or I don't know, getting a coffee in a non-reusable cup, something like that. So we all live in a system where it's impossible to be sustainability angels, and nobody needs to be completely squeaky clean in order to get involved and be concerned. My big motivation for doing this over the last few years is the future generations, my kids. You can have any motivation you like, but that's mine. And it's good to think about your motivation for trying to get involved with sustainability, and particularly maybe around the climate emergency. It really helps drive you forward when things are sometimes a bit more tricky. So we started a project. We've been speaking about it for a while, but we started a trainer project at the University of York, along with our collective at Speak Carbon. We're a Yorkshire-based collective, but actually we're beginning to bring trainers across the UK together to do this particular type of training in carbon literacy, which I'll talk about a little bit in a couple of slides' time. This program was super exciting because I live in York and I've been absolutely desperate to be doing something significant, and this was the opportunity to do that, to take a group of students and staff from the university and put them across into a training program which allowed them to go and take the course, take a carbon literacy course and roll it out, cascade it across the university. And really important that everybody has the opportunity for this knowledge, for this platform to be able to build from, understand what we're trying to tackle, particularly where we are in York and the University of York, and take it forward into actions that will hopefully build this better world, and then these actions that will also decrease emissions and help us manage the emergency that we find ourselves in. So it's a fantastic program. It's quite new, so we were using a toolkit developed at Manchester Metropolitan University, who've taken carbon literacy forward for a number of years, and it hasn't actually been released yet. So this was a very sort of new, cutting-edge way of delivering carbon literacy across universities. So just very quickly, with the Speak Carbon Collective, what we're trying to do is get us to communicate around the impacts of carbon and other emissions on the planet, collaborate in our communities and your communities, workplace across the university, having that shared language, which is why we call it Speak Carbon, gain accredited carbon literacy certification. So that is what I'm just about to talk about. That makes sense in a minute. But yeah, also avoid the what did you do question from future generations. Make sure that when you knew, you had the ability to do something, and that's really important, I think, that sense of agency. So just very quickly before we go into the main part of today, which is actually going to be a section around international climate justice that we have as part of the training. Carbon literacy is an awareness of carbon costs, so we try and create that awareness and awareness around impacts, some of the science, some of what's going to happen where we are and around the world, and their ability and motivation to reduce emissions. So that's, again, that's agency, that's having the feeling that you can actually do something and get involved. And that's yourself, but we're really, really keen on you feeling that agency as part of a community and as part of your organisation as well. So to get a carbon literacy certificate, we all like to have a certificate, don't we? It's part of it, as well as the learning. You have to undertake a day's worth of learning, and that's all been brought together by the team that you're just about to meet, so that you can do that. Some of that self-guided learning, a lot of that is facilitated learning in training, as you're just about to see an example of, and covers a whole heap of information around the climate emergency, but also make sure that you fill in 2 actions, so 2 pledges to take action based on what you've learned, hopefully where we are in our community. And this is the network that's beginning to be built, and it's really, really taking off, particularly over the last 2 years in the UK. So 26,000 people across the UK are certified. We do a lot of work in universities, but in particular at local authority level. We're beginning to do some work, and when I say we, I'm talking about the collective, with some big organisations, some big employers as well. So having this knowledge and this certificate is really, really valuable, where you are, but also maybe where you're going to as well. And you can see there we've got 67 certified training professionals, which this group will all become part of as well. Key that we have people that are able to deliver this at professional standard as well. We look at trying to deliver those 5 to 15% of carbon savings through those pledges as well. That's that's research based, actually, that number. So we do think that, yeah, at least 10% on an individual basis we can lead to, but making sure that we use our influence to get others involved with things like what we're doing today, with events like what we're doing today, make sure that we can actually reach much further than that and take that 15% to as many people as we possibly can. So I'm now going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over to the professional team that we have in the university itself. A couple of introductions, and then we're going to actually do some of the training. Just encourage you all to get involved as much as you can. The more participation you put in, the more you'll understand from it, and the more it'll feel like carbon literacy itself. So just handing over to you guys now.
Hi guys, just a quick introduction from me. My name's Martha. I'm on the way to becoming a carbon literacy trainer. I'd just like to quickly go through why I joined the programme and yeah, why I'm really enjoying it. So first of all, the carbon literacy sessions, I love them. I found them really useful. And when we got offered the opportunity to become trainers, I thought I'd grasp it with both hands because I loved them so much. And one of the reasons I wanted to do it was spreading awareness of carbon literacy and to encourage more people to pledge their reduction of carbon footprint. As we all know, it's such a pressing and important issue. And not only have I achieved that and now being able to deliver some really great sessions, I've also developed loads of skills like presentation, communication, teamwork and leadership with the other trainers. So yeah, I'd really, really encourage you to get involved if you can, because it's such a great opportunity.
Hi, I'm Marjon. I'm a second year biology student here at York, and I'd just like to start by seconding everything Martha just said. I personally undertook the training last summer because I thought it would be relevant to my degree, and I'm really interested in things like climate change and global warming. The course, doing it really opened my eyes as to the extent to which it affects absolutely everyone. So I've learned a lot, and then being offered the opportunity to become a trainer myself, I had to take it because the course was really enjoyable and, most importantly, really accessible. So yeah, I just think it's such a good opportunity for absolutely everyone who is able to take it to kind of make the most of it and take advantage.
All right, and hi, I'm Savannah. I just want to check that everybody can hear me because the rain's just started coming down and I've got a glass roof above me. Okay, good, thumbs up, thanks. So I was a student here several years ago, studied English Lit, and now I work in the Centre for Global Programmes, arranging short courses for international students. And, you know, I've got motivations anyway, as the others do, for wanting to try to help reduce our carbon emissions, but certainly my job has made me feel a good weight of guilt, really, about the fact that we get international students to come over for just sometimes a couple of weeks. And so I thought, well, if I can be involved in anything that might be able to engage them or the rest of the university community in activities so that we're doing something, so that also offsetting really what those flights that are being taken, then, you know, I've got to do it. So just echoing what the others have said, though, have really enjoyed the training. So yeah, if you can get involved just by doing the training yourself, if you can spare 2 Wednesday afternoons, we'll give you some information at the end about when the next trainings are. But yeah, anyway, you can get involved. But I think we'll head straight into the activity for today. And it'll just be a taster really of what the full training sessions, some of the activities that we do during the sessions. But, you know, engage as much as you like. We'd love to hear from you in the chat, or if you're brave enough and you want to turn your camera or unmute yourself, that's great too. So I'll just share my screen here. It's been a bit slow on my side. Can I just check whether you can see that green page?
I can just see a loading prompt at the moment.
Me too. Okay, give it a sec. I'll just back out of this and see if I can refresh that. If not, I might just have one of the others share it and I'll.
While we're waiting for that to load, can I just ask, you mentioned about 2 afternoons for the certification, if I've understood that correctly. Is there additional work? Is there kind of homework as well?
So there's the pledge, which Pete mentioned briefly, which is something that comes after the course. So it's something you can think about during the course and ask us any questions, or our emails are open to you as well. But that's something that really should only take 1 or 2 hours after the course. And that's where you kind of bring in the training that you've just had and consolidate that and evidence that in your form. Before the course, we do send you a link to a video. And there's just a couple of bits and bobs that you can look at if you have the time beforehand. But there's not, I mean, the others, you know, can add in here, but there's not a big amount of work that you do outside of the trainings, to be honest. It's mostly about showing up to the trainings and contributing there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that.
All right, can you see my green screen now? Good stuff. Okay, so we'll begin now with this. It's an international footprints quiz we're going to do because we're talking about international carbon footprints and vulnerability to climate change. So we're going to do an activity really exploring international climate justice, so the inequity and disparity and responsibility for carbon emissions and the vulnerability to climate change that different countries have. So we'll start with, what is a carbon footprint? So as the slide says, it's a measure of the amount of greenhouse gases released to the atmosphere as a result of our activities. and we can calculate the carbon footprint of absolutely anything, whether that's countries, which we'll be discussing today, but it could be cities, different organizations, individuals, which we'll also touch on, different projects and products, you know, that you pop into the shop and buy, and being able to look at a footprint for that individual product. So that's just a bit of background really about footprints. Okay, so there are two different approaches to calculating carbon footprints. And as you can see here on these maps, there's the production-based one on the left and the consumption-based one on the right. Production-based footprints include all greenhouse gas emissions that occur within the geographical boundaries of a country, whereas consumption-based footprints account for the balance of trade, so subtracting emissions associated with exports and adding on emissions associated with imports. Does that make sense to people? Because please ask now if it doesn't, because it'll help all of our understanding, I think, going forward, and feel free to ask in the chat. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at footprints, and we're going to play higher, lower, or in between. So we're looking at production-based footprints on a per person basis. So I'll just go back one slide. So production-based is that one on the left, and those are the ones that we're going to be using for this game. So we'll show you the production-based carbon footprints per person of a number of countries, and then we'll introduce another country, and a poll will appear asking you where you would place that country amongst the existing ones. So you can see here we've got the USA, Egypt, Burundi, and India, and there's a bit of information there about how many tons of carbon emissions per person per year are emitted on average in these countries. So, you know, in the USA, the average is 18.3 tons, in Egypt, 3.2, Burundi, 0.4. So our first question is going to be about India. And this is now your first question, which is going to come up in a poll in a moment that Marjan's going to begin. Is the per person footprint of India higher than the USA when we're looking at this order of countries, in between the US and Egypt, between Egypt and Burundi, or lower than Burundi? Yeah, your answers are coming in. Just going to wait for a few more, but there is, oh, it's changing a bit. Yeah, so most people are thinking that it's higher than the US, or in between the US and Egypt. And it's in between Egypt and Burundi, actually, which is not one that many of you guessed in the end. So India, the per person per year carbon emissions are 2.3 tons. So we can see it in the lineup there. Okay, so next we're going to look at China. And I don't know if having just answered about India is going to help you with this one, but is the per person footprint of China, where do you think that would show up? Is it higher than the US in terms of emissions, between the US and Egypt, between Egypt and India, between India and Burundi, or lower than Burundi? There's some really interesting answers coming in here, and I think it's going to make any discussion. Marjan's going to talk about vulnerability later, and different countries' vulnerability. I think it's going to make that interesting. So anyway, so we're getting definitely, most people are thinking it's higher than the US or between the US and Egypt. And the answer is yes, B, between the US and Egypt. So 8.6 tons of CO2 emissions on average per person per year in China. So you can see it's there in the lineup. And we're going to keep going now with Australia. Just a couple more countries that we want to fit in here to get an understanding of where different countries stand. Okay, so in that poll, a lot of you are thinking, let's see, I won't reveal it yet because I don't want to influence what you answer. Yeah, between China and Egypt, C is the most popular answer here, and it's A, higher than the US. And so we will discuss a little bit more some of these a bit more later, but again, in the training, we go slightly more in depth into what's behind these numbers, but we particularly look at the UK as well in some of the things which drive emissions, both production-based and consumption-based in the UK. So you can see Australia there is at the top at the moment with an average of 24.2 tonnes of CO2 emissions per person per year, more than all of these other countries at the moment. So we're adding in 4 more countries, which you can see at the bottom here, and they're arranged still now in order of their footprints. Sorry, they're arranged now, that wasn't on the last slide. What do you notice when you look at the footprints of these 10 countries? Do you see any patterns or similarities or things that countries have in common? Again, feel free to unmute or put something in the chat, and I can't quite see the chat, so if anyone wants to read anything out, that'd be great.
It looks like more developed countries are the bigger polluters instead of the other ones.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. Yeah, is there kind of another, what would the other side to that be, I suppose, which is kind of the same as what you've just said, but looking at it from the other end?
So we've had some answers in the chat. Someone has said that lots of animal farming could potentially lead to a higher footprint. Yeah, definitely. That farming animals is like a big cause of carbon emissions and just greenhouse gas emissions in general. Someone else has said use of coal is an influencing factor. Yeah, so these are production-based footprints. So the countries that produce more fossil fuels will have high footprints, like Australia, for example. Someone else has said industrial production is more influential than the individual footprint. Yeah, absolutely. So again, these are production-based footprints, so we're not taking into account the amount of that each individual's carbon consumption or consumption-based carbon footprint. So yeah, absolutely, all really great answers in the chat there. Thank you. Sorry, just one last one before we move on. Someone else has said, is mineral extraction a cause? Yes, so we won't get into the kind of individual causes in this activity, but in the actual training, we definitely look at all the kind of different activities that cause emissions, whether that be individual or industrial. So we look at farming, concrete production, cement production, all sorts of things like that. And yeah, we go into much more depth. Proportion of individuals living in property results in a lower footprint per person. Yeah, absolutely. We'll take a deeper look at that in a little while when we kind of look at vulnerability, but yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your contributions.
Yeah, all of your comments on noticing that relationship between kind of poverty or development and the emissions that we're seeing, and as Marjan says, the vulnerability then, which we'll move on to next, that's spot on. Those are great observations. So last quiz question. Where do you think the UK sits in this order now that we've looked at these other footprints? So we've got in between Australia and the US, between the US and Argentina, between Argentina and China, and between China and Dominica. Yeah, okay, so the vast majority of you are thinking it's between the US and Argentina. Yeah, we'll end that poll and have a look. So here we are. Oh, the image hasn't popped up, has it? There it is, between China and Dominica there. So our average per person footprint is 7.2 tons of CO2 emissions. If any of you are surprised by that, it's always interesting to hear what surprised you about that, or if you thought we might be kind of higher or lower up the order there. So, oh, sorry, skipping ahead. So yeah, the UK and some other European countries have a somewhat lower footprint than Australia, the US, China, you know, as you can see here. But it's important to remember that, as we touched on, these are production-based footprints and they don't take consumption into account. So someone was asking about minerals and mineral extracting there. So it's interesting, you have to think about which camp they would fit into and therefore which statistics they're going to affect. In the full training, we take a more in-depth look at consumption-based footprints, which are really interesting to compare with the numbers in order, which we've just seen. But I just wanted to point out that, for example, Australia produces a lot of oil, but most of this is exported to other countries and consumed there. So the same goes for China, where their consumption-based footprint's much lower than their production-based one. So we would see this order really change very radically if we were looking on a consumption basis. So we'll give you a link to be able to explore different countries' data more later on in the session. We'll share a bit more info on this, but now I'm going to hand over to Marjan, who's going to talk through different countries' vulnerability.
Thank you, Savannah. So just before I do my bit, someone asked where we can find this data. So there's a massive spreadsheet that kind of goes in a lot more detail and depth. But that we can share that at the end of the session in the chat, and it's something that we go into more depth in the actual training, and that is shared with you. So yeah, I will share my screen now. Can everyone see that okay? Cool, thank you. So now we're going to look at vulnerability to climate change. And this takes into account a country's exposure and sensitivity, and the capacity to adapt to the negative effects of climate change. The data used here is from the 2016 ND Gain Country Index, which measures the overall vulnerability to climate change, considering 6 life-supporting sectors. That includes food, water, health, ecosystem services, human habitat, and infrastructure. So what do you notice when you look at this about the vulnerability of each of the countries that we just looked at? For example, in relation to each other or their carbon footprints? Again, feel free to unmute yourself or comment in the chat. I will try to see if I can see the chat. Oh yeah, so someone has said that globally, BIPOC communities are disproportionately vulnerable overall. Yep, absolutely. Lower footprint, more vulnerable. Yep, exactly. So it's quite a noticeable difference between a country's vulnerability and their footprint. Those that contribute the least are more vulnerable. Yep, again, it's a huge difference. So the key message to highlight, which you have all done, is that there's the least developed and lowest income countries are actually the most vulnerable to climate change, whilst the most developed and high income countries that you can see at the top here are the least vulnerable. So in short, the countries with the highest footprints are least vulnerable to the effects, while those with the lowest footprints are the most vulnerable. If we move on, so these two plots here are showing you the relationship between development, footprint, and the vulnerability that we've just been exploring. So for all the countries that this data is available, that's the right-hand graph there, and then the left-hand graph is the countries that we just looked at. The plots show the level of development as measured by the Human Development Index on the x-axis and the carbon footprint on the y-axis. And the colour of the symbols highlight the vulnerability of each country to climate change. We can clearly see that the most developed countries have the highest footprints and the lower vulnerability to climate change than the less developed countries. And there's of course some variation, which is more obviously seen on the right-hand graph. But most notably, fossil fuel rich countries tend to have higher footprints because of fugitive or escaping emissions associated with extraction, transport, and processing fossil fuels. Also, some highly developed countries, such as some European countries, have been taking concerted climate action and have started to reduce their carbon footprints. But again, note that these are production-based footprints, so they might have had lower production to begin with. And then these graphs here kind of further explore the footprints and vulnerability by world regions this time. So all the plots are on the same axis and scales as the previous slide, and we can see regional groupings that are used in tracking progress on sustainable development goals. So note here that other than Australia and New Zealand, the least vulnerable countries are all in Europe and North America. And the most vulnerable countries are all either least developed countries in sub-Saharan Africa or small island developing states in Oceania. So I know that these graphs can be a bit difficult to kind of digest. So there's this website, it's quite a good one, called carbonmap.org, that kind of explores all these different aspects of climate change. And I will try to show you that video now. Just going to quickly stop sharing and then reshare my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. Cool. I will also share my sound, so if everyone can just make sure they're muted, because otherwise it echoes, that would be very helpful.
We're used to seeing the world like this. Though if countries are resized to represent their true area, it actually looks more like this. But area is only one way of looking at the world. This site gives some others, such as where the people are and where the money is. Mainly though, this site is about climate change. Browse the responsibility maps to see how each country helps drive global carbon emissions, from extracting fossil fuels and burning them, through to consuming the goods and services that result. You can also see historical emissions, most of which are still in the air, and potential emissions that are currently locked up in coal, oil and gas reserves. In addition, you'll find some vulnerability maps which show the people most at risk from climate change, such as those already exposed to droughts, floods and extreme temperatures. Click on a country to see its national data, and if you like, use the shading drop-down to overlay extra information. For example, we can add shading to show where population is rising, the red areas, or falling, the green areas. If we then click the emissions map, we can see that the countries with the fastest growing populations currently release very little CO2. But click to the people at risk map, and we can see that those same booming populations are very exposed to climate change impacts. So that's the carbon map. Click around to get a better handle on this crucial but complex topic.
Cool. So I will stop sharing my screen there. So that was carbonmap.org. I will put a link to that in the chat for you guys to have a look at any point. And yeah,
that one in really quickly.
Yeah,
because yeah, it is such a good web page, as you said.
Savannah, was there anything else you were about to say? Sorry.
No, well, I could read out quickly what Joe's put in the chat, because I think it's an interesting observation. Joe says it's interesting in the context of the red storm warning that's currently imposed over parts of England that the UK is assessed as being one of the least vulnerable. So, you know, you could imagine what countries at the sharp end are experiencing, perhaps. So that's just kind of interesting to think about. And then, Pete, did you want to speak about what you've just popped in the chat there?
It's just the data. I know it was just from a question earlier about where that data came from. So you can use Climate Watch to look into that data, or you can come along to a session and have that discussion with everybody. But that's where the data comes from, that spreadsheet.
great. So yeah, that is it in terms of the activity from me and Savannah. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them. We're all here to answer all of your questions, including Pete and Martha and Joe. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed that little taster activity. It kind of gives you a little bit of insight into what the actual training could include. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Fantastic. That was incredible, and it's obviously I've gone through the whole process of the trainer with the three of you that are here. There are another 5 as well doing this, and it's incredible how competent and knowledgeable that you are on all of these sort of subjects and slides, and don't get fazed by any of the quite tricky questions that were thrown your way. So yeah, just now, as Marjon said, to open this up to you to ask any questions about what you've just seen, anything that it made you feel, or anything about carbon literacy in a wider context in the university, or even outside the university as well. So you can use the chat, or you can unmute yourselves now. Just give you a few seconds to ask any questions.
Well, people are considering how to phrase what they want to say. I will just say that we've got another 3 potential sessions arranged at the moment, one for end of April. And actually, am I right on that? Is it 3 or 2? And it's 3, okay. And then early May and June for other sessions. So if people are interested and want to sign up, I'll drop the link into the chat. If you've already signed up for some of the earlier sessions and weren't chosen for those, you can go back to that form and sign up for some of the later sessions.
Just because I think I kind of forgot to say it when we were introducing ourselves, that one of the reasons that I've really enjoyed this training and this topic really is that I felt I can kind of sink my teeth into it, because it's about carbon emissions. It's not, you know, it can feel quite overwhelming if it's generally about the climate crisis, or you know, how to mitigate if it's not a local problem, or, you know, there's kind of, it can feel a little bit like something that's difficult to get involved with. But the fact that this is really focused on carbon emissions for me was very attractive.
We've broken the deadlock on the questions, and now they start to roll in. So I'm just going to come across to Anne now, who has popped your hand up just for your question, Anne. Thank you.
Yeah, it was going back to the 5 to 15% carbon savings per person that you mentioned earlier on. I wondered if you could just expand on that and say, give an example or what has been happening. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So this was so the Carbon Literacy project started in 2013, but started to gain real traction in 2015 when the Paris Accord was signed, and you know, it seems like a long time ago now, but it felt like a big moment. And a company called Jacobs took their training into their I think it's a consultancy business, and they measured how much they thought the reduction had been across their company from before and after taking carbon literacy, and they've written it up. And so they obviously, for you know, particularly talking to in terms of a university, there's probably more research that's needed, but they came up with the conclusion that it meant that there was a 5 to 15% reduction in their particular company. And using that, that's what the carbon literacy say that you can achieve by rolling this out across organisations, or for individuals as well. It's a little bit, yeah, I mean, it's quite, carbon literacy is very, very new, so there's not huge amounts of research that might be behind exactly what impact that has. But yeah, certainly making people aware. We understand that behaviour change is a huge part of making the transition to net zero in the UK. I think about 60% of what we need to do relies on behaviour change, and that's at the heart of this. So it's a figure they use to take forward, and I think potentially it could be a lot more than that, particularly if people are taking the course and then engaging other people. So if you think of the ripple effect.
Because it ties in, Pete, I wonder if we want to also jump straight to Sarah's question, which is, in the training, how much is about national emissions and what to do, and how much about the personal impact a person could make? Because yeah, I suppose I would say that it does cover both. We want everyone to be thinking in both arenas really about where emissions can be reduced, but in terms of your pledges, of course, that's things that you would have control over and what difference you can make perhaps in your work community or in your personal life. But we do want to be looking at what changes need to be made on a broader scale as well.
Fantastic, yeah, great. And then go back to Yuria, I hope I pronounced that right. In terms of historical emissions on the site, it seems that the British Empire and its colonies meant large amounts of emissions. Would that be correct? Is there anyone who wants to speak to that?
Yeah, so absolutely. What we tend to see is that countries that developed earlier, because they had the resources and the big enough economies to do so, like the UK, America, most of Europe, emitted loads of carbon when they were developing, so a couple hundred years ago. And now that we've kind of reached a level where we can stop with, less, we're kind of over the point of industrial revolution and all that stuff, our carbon emissions have decreased to an extent. Of course, we're still nowhere near what we should be, but then countries that are now developing because they have the resources, so other areas of the world like the Middle East or sub-Saharan Africa and all those places, their emissions are obviously going to be higher because they are doing what we did before now, and that's not to say that that's their fault, and it's really important to kind of draw attention to the fact that we can't be antagonizing countries without kind of looking at the context of their emissions. So yeah, that's a really great point, and it's something that we do cover to an extent. And again, on the carbon map video, they mentioned about growing populations and how places with high populations actually have lower footprints. That's a really important point to make as well. So yeah, and in terms of the historical emissions, those are really important because they stay around for a really long time in the atmosphere. So all the emissions that the UK or Europe made a couple hundred years ago are still very much in the air and contributing to global warming and climate change and all sorts of stuff like that. Another question in the chat as well that I saw: does the course include how to best communicate this kind of information to others without coming across as shocked, judgmental, etc.? I think some people find this whole subject area so intimidating they just don't want to engage. Yeah, so we have, what I personally also really, really liked about this course is that there's a whole module on it to do with communicating climate change. And as someone who's, got scientific background and doing a sciencey degree, what they don't teach me in my degree is how to talk to others about what I learn. But this course did a really good job of the steps that you need to take when you're telling people about it. So, not being judgmental and saying, antagonizing someone for something they're doing, and rather understanding why they do that thing and how they could improve it. So there's a big focus on communicating effectively in order to actually achieve what you're trying to achieve rather than scare people off. And there's a whole presentation in the actual course going through all the really important aspects of communication, and there's a couple of activities that we do to kind of practice putting those into context, and we give you fake scenarios to try see if you can use what you've just learned about communication in practice. I will stop talking now and let someone else answer any questions they want to.
Yeah, amazing. Some thanks there for a really insightful response. Back to that, I've got one in terms of national carbon footprints. This is a great carbon literacy question. Which of the two, production or consumption, tends to be higher? Does anyone want to speak to that?
It's a great question, because it's really hitting the nail on the head in terms of what we were trying to achieve in that activity that we were just doing. So essentially, it's you're obviously thinking about, does it differ by country, you know, which would be higher, and that's exactly what happens. So when we look at India and China and their or Australia, as I was mentioning before, because they produce so much oil, or countries which are mineral rich and which are exporting a lot of their resources, that impacts obviously on their production based footprint. But then when you look at, for example, China, which we do a bit more closely on the course, you know, you'll see that the amount that they're bringing in imports is far less than what they're exporting. So, but then if you look at the UK, it would be a really different scenario. So you couldn't really have a blanket statement about, well, consumption-based footprints are usually always higher in every country. It really depends on the country, what natural resources they have, and how much, you know, their culture is set up to consume. And I think we kind of are probably all well aware that in the Western world, we're very much set up as consumers now. And so that makes a difference in terms of the national footprints of this country, you know, the UK or the US or, yeah, other European nations.
Fabulous, yeah, perfect. It was great in terms of, that's what we would hope in a carbon literacy. We don't really guide the conversations, we just hope that people come up with sort of questions around what we've spoken about, and then discuss them. But it really is up to the group that are in the training at the time to come up with a discussion that it matters to them, and that's really powerful. So it's great that came up. Just having a look at another good one. I know we've discussed this as a training group recently. In the training, how much is about national emissions and what to do? So you might think of that as a systemic emissions question, and how much about the personal impact a person can make, so more of the individual emissions. Would anyone like to speak to that? From Sarah.
So we have two separate activities for each of those. I'm just trying to find a question in the chat. Yeah, so we have a look at the production-based footprint, as we did just now in this activity, and there's a very similar activity to do with the consumption-based footprint. That one is centered more around the UK and all of our consumption-based footprints, and then we compare that to countries like China and India, and there's a huge difference when you kind of switch perspective from production to consumption. So in terms of, that's what we look at for the national emissions, and there's other presentations where we look at the kind of national activities that are releasing lots of carbon. And then in terms of the personal impact of each person, individuals, we do loads of training in how much emissions are produced from each of our day-to-day activities, and changes that we can make that are relatively easy but can have quite big impacts, and then we compare those activities to see which ones have the highest impacts and which ones have less huge impacts. And the reason we do it that way is because we don't want to look at just one aspect in isolation, because obviously, you know, system change and individual change are two sides of the same coin, and it's really important to pay attention to both sides and not just focus on individual action, because obviously in lots of individuals, as much as they can make a difference, it's much more difficult to get them to make a difference, and it's best to target kind of both sides of the coin. So we're centered around educating you on things that you can do, and also things that should be done at a government level, or even like a business and corporation level. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great. it's quite a big question, so I popped in a bit of research from Climate Outreach that I sent to all of you, and it's got a video in there. So if you've only got a minute, you can watch the video, but if you've got a bit longer, you can read the full report about how what you put across really well, Mahjong, but a little bit more reading into depth, into the deeper side of that.
Thank you.
We talk on the course about things that we hope anyway are really relevant to people. So food, travel, things that as individuals we're all familiar with. We all do, and we all speak with our mates about it. So it's ways that we can kind of have influence, areas of our life that we do actually have influence, as well as looking at the larger systems. We had somebody on the last course who lived in a passive house, and was really interesting just to have, you know, to discuss kind of how they transformed their house and what that meant for their bills, and you know, it just was real life experience. So a lot of that richness comes from the different participants on the course, which is why it's really nice to have it in the university setting, I found, because I made links with other staff, and I felt like, you know, people who I hadn't really known, and I learned a lot from them, and followed up later, and we kind of did some carbon calculating together afterwards. And so just the networking side as well is a really interesting part of it.
Perfect. I hope that was really helpful and started some more thinking. And yeah, linking that to what matters to people is the key part of carbon literacy that you guys bring to the training. I've got a question from William, who has been seeing a lot of references to decarbonisation. Is decarbonisation covered in the training, or what does that mean? He also said he's happy to Google it, but you guys are much better than Google it, explaining these things. Would anyone like to speak to that?
Yeah, so we have a part of the course which addresses offsetting, and we discuss how we can offset and whether it's good or whether it's not as well, and we have a discussion around that. And another activity we do is called Postcards from the Future, where we start to look at how we can reduce carbon and what like that would look in the future. For individuals, companies and businesses as well. Yeah, I think that covers it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. They're two really good parts, aren't they, in terms of understanding about how we might have to reduce some emissions that are already up into the atmosphere, and also that sort of future, that how we create less carbon within what we do. Yeah, it's really good parts. Are there any other parts that particularly talk about? I mean, the whole course is very much about decarbonisation, isn't it? Taking carbon out of our energy production. Excellent. William saying thank you. Does Joy asking about carbon accounting prior to the offsetting step? So carbon footprinting, you might call it.
So yeah, we look at footprints from institutions. We try and find as much data as we can on, for example, the University of York. Usually we try and tailor it to whatever institution the course is being delivered in, and we look at where their emissions are coming from. So whether it's from waste, from travel, food, or stuff like that on an institutional level, and for staff and students. And then once we do that, we move on to looking at the action plans that have been proposed by those institutions or by research groups that have either ranked, for example, universities based on their emissions and what they're doing to offset those. And there's a document that has looked at the best things universities can do in order to kind of reduce their emissions, and we have a little look at that as well. So yeah, we do look at where the carbon is coming from and how we can target that.
Just a quick example there on that as well. I'm just going to put something in the chat that I found really interesting. It's a web page that you can punch in. I haven't looked thoroughly into the accuracy of it, but it generally makes sense. I tested it on my Facebook versus a web page, a university's web page, which is one that I work on, and it was just interesting to look at, you know, in my Hotmail account versus my Gmail account. So you can punch in any web page, and it basically tells you the emissions associated with that. and it's based on really where the energy for that company, so where kind of the massive computers that are doing all the processing are stored, what warehouse that is, and what the energy source for that warehouse is. So it's just really interesting to look at kind of, are we being, as clean as we can on campus in terms of where we're sourcing our energy from for, running our computing systems and things. Yeah, William says, this web page is dirtier than 60% of web pages tested. Yes, it can make you feel bad, definitely. I wouldn't spend all day on it, but it is interesting just to look at for comparison. So just in terms of, looking at decarbonisation and looking at areas that we can impact. Yeah, it was a York one. So it's just interesting to kind of know that, and perhaps in your personal life as well. I haven't tested Google versus Ecosia, which is a more, for those of you who have heard of Ecosia, it's a search engine that plants trees, for every certain number of searches made. But it's all interesting stuff. So a lot of that comes out in the course, I suppose I would say, is that we kind of share information and look at things from different angles. And it's not all necessarily focused on kind of policy, which we perhaps don't have control over, but we do look at the ways that we can influence perhaps local council level or through our jobs, management. We don't go into kind of like toilet papering buildings or things like that, radical action, but we do have interesting discussions about things. We are better than Oxford. That's great to know, William.
It's such a good way. I've never seen that website before. It's such a good way of getting a conversation started, isn't it? And we're better than Oxford. Fantastic. That's a challenge right there, isn't it? Love it. So looking at the time, and apparently Guggen is carbon neutral from 2007. Keyword in that maybe Monica would be apparently. I'm not sure if you put that in deliberately, but this has been a great example of how you guys have managed to bring a carbon literacy course together, and how you train and how that happens, but also how you can field some really quite complicated discussions or have them amongst yourself. So you're going to have plenty more chance to ask questions and get involved in this subject by signing up to do the Carbon Literacy project. You will get certified as carbon literate at the end of it if you hand in pledges, and the trainers will help you write those and send them off to the Carbon Literacy project. And that means you can join this network of people who have these sort of conversations. You will have a whole 7 hours, so a day's worth of time to do that. Think about all of these different points and discuss them with your peers, and then start to take action. So just going to say like a massive thank you to all of the trainers who've not just turned up today, but have also undertaken the responsibility of carrying training forward throughout. Big thank you to Joe, also as well, who's put this all together for the university. And we're getting a lot of inquiries at our Speak Carbon Collective from other universities, not Oxford yet, but maybe they should be, but certainly there'll be a lot of interest about what you're doing here. It is quite new and unique, and it's been really powerful over the last few months. I'm just so impressed with the way that we've been doing this for a number of years, but the way that you can conduct training now at a professional level is incredible. So well done, everybody. We've got the sign up has been popped up again there, and we should be promoting that throughout the year. Let everybody have the opportunity to leave on time, and say a massive thank you for all of you to come along. And it doesn't work without participation and putting up some great questions and getting involved and doing all of those things. So you've played your part as well. Thanks so much for everybody for putting this together. Bye, Anne. I can see you waving. See you later. Excellent.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, William. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Excellent. Anyone who's stayed on to ask for a question when everyone's not here, please let us know now. It might be you've been called off to do something else while the session's been on. Excellent, guys. Well, I'm going to call that and maybe just have a couple left on.
I'm not sure if actually we're able to. Oh, should we do something? Do we pause the recording?
Yes, if you could pause it. There we go.
I can't tell if I did it or